So may I say hello to the interpreters who are doing a job that I used to do at an earlier time in my life. And can I start out by thanking the organizers for having invited me. I'm always ready to accept any pretext for coming to Prague from Brussels, where I have been living for a number of years now. But I also realize that I'm separating you from lunch, which at 1 o'clock is a difficult thing to be doing, so I've decided to reduce my remarks from about 75 minutes to about 40. The way I do these things is that I keep an eye on the audience, and when I see 6 people dozing off, taking a little nap, because they didn't have time to get their coffee, I'll stop, okay? Small democratic states. Many of you know about Freedom House, which is an American organization that publishes annually a report about all the nations in the world. These days they do 195. Experts will notice that it's more than 193 people who are in the UN. Well, that includes Taiwan, of course, and possibly Somaliland, I don't know. And so they gauge the degree of freedom of world's countries, which, for the sake of the argument, I will equate with democracy. Of the 195 countries that the Freedom House looks at, 144 in their latest 2015 report were deemed free or partly free, as democratic in my parlance, or partly democratic. Now, if we take away the big countries, 3 of the P5, India, Indonesia, Japan, Brazil, and a few others, we are still left with about 135 small democratic countries. And about 100 of them is exactly the countries I will not be talking about, because I will be focusing, for what it's worth, on Europe. Let me mention that I'm not a professional historian, even though I'll be doing a lot of talk about history, and many of you will no doubt find fault with many of my observations, opinions, and especially generalizations. And since I always adopt the opinion of the last person I have listened to, I can assure you that even ahead of time, even before you voiced your disagreements with me, I agree with you. I absolutely agree with your objections. Now, what I want to say is that the wave of immigrants that is overflowing Europe is endangering the multilateral order that we live in. Or at least it seems to be doing so. Or in the very least it inspires fears that this is so. And amazingly, these fears are harbored by many of those who themselves are uncomfortable with this international multilateral order. By people who don't like the EU, by people who would do away with NATO, by people who believe the Bilderberg conferences are a Kabbalistic conspiracy or something of that nature. But even if the refugee crisis were endangering the world order, or the world order as we know it, and I will examine this proposal a bit later, it would not be the first time in Europe's history that its order would have been upended. Let us do a little time travel to reflect upon some of the fundamental changes Europe has witnessed. I spent a little time in Tuscany this past summer. I recommend it, by the way. So I spent a little time in Tuscany and became acquainted with what in England is known as the road to Rome, and in Italy is referred to as the Via Francigena, the French road. It is the passage that the Archbishop of Canterbury took to reach Rome in the 10th century, and ever since has been used by pilgrims of all types seeking to visit the Holy City. I'm going to be a bit ahistorical here and sweep across several centuries. The pilgrim paths threading through Europe, of which the path leading to Compostela is probably the best known, symbolize a Europe linked together by the net of religion. Needless to say, only a tiny minority of Europe's population ever visited more than the nearest market town in those days. But this minuscule elite found a common cultural context and a common language, Latin, wherever they would find themselves, be they men of the church, feudal lords, or merchants. The common context was the Catholic religion. The order, quote unquote, of the day was anything but peaceful. The Black Death smote 30% or more of Europe's population in its time. France battled England for 100 years. The Borgias gave us a wonderful TV series. I hope you've all been watching. The Ottomans conquered chunk after chunk of the Balkans. But couldn't one agree that by and large a degree of order reigned in Europe? It certainly reigned in comparison with what followed. Literally, this is especially for people who are here from abroad, literally up the street, 2 miles from here where we are sitting, is a place called the White Mountain. It's not really much of a mountain, but it's a place where a fateful battle was fought, which in 1620 kicked off the 30-Year War. That war engulfed most of Europe with devastating consequences. The church schism put an end to Catholicism as the cultural and political glue of Europe. The multilateral order of the time collapsed. The 1648 Peace of Westphalia substituted something novel, a rule whereby every ruler was entitled to his own religion, and as for the emergent international order, it established principles which are not alien to our understanding: respect for boundaries of sovereign states and non-interference in domestic affairs of others. If there was a force that came close to destroying this pan-European order, it was the French Revolution and its aftermath. If there was one person who almost destroyed it, it was Napoleon Bonaparte. In the wake of the Napoleonic Wars, Europe was reshaped again. The 1815 Congress of Vienna pushed back revolutionary ambitions, but seeded the concept of nationalism. Within half a century or so, France incorporated the territory of Savoy and thus reached what had been described as its natural borders, namely the Rhine, the Alps, and the Pyrenees. Of course, an awful lot of this territory had not been inhabited by French people. Prussia emerged as the strongest state in the German-speaking region of Europe, and Italy was on its way to unification. I have always felt that nationalism is a doubtful principle of statecraft. First, with a few exceptions like Iceland, it is well nigh impossible to define a territory whose borders would completely encompass a single nation. Ethnicity has a fractal character. At least in border areas, and often much more broadly, ethnic groups intermingle, so that however small a piece of territory one examines, there will generally be some prevailing ethnicity and some minority one. One of my favorite examples comes from Belgium. Now, we all know that, there is a prevailing French-speaking area and a Dutch-speaking area. Some of us know also that there is a small German-speaking area in the east of the country. In this German-speaking area, there is the town of Verviers, which is French-speaking. And in Verviers, there's a German-speaking quarter. In this German-speaking quarter, there are probably some French-speaking households. I would bet on that. But in addition to this fractal character of ethnicity, how does one define ethnicity in the first place? Where are the differences in language and culture great enough to define different ethnic groups? Very often, ethnicity is a matter of politics and history. It is a matter of politics and history, not of linguistics or of cultural anthropology, that we have Germans and Austrians living in two separate states, whereas we no longer have an independent Kingdom of Bavaria or an independent Kingdom of Hanover. Similarly, it is a matter of politics and history that Venice and Sicily are not viewed as separate ethnics living in separate countries. Small countries. And isn't it one aspect of this conference to reflect about small countries? The Balkans in its time turned into nothing else than an incubator of small countries. Oppressed people resisted the Ottoman supremacy, Russia opposed the Ottomans, and the various ethnic groups fought one another. The San Stefano Treaty of 1878 recognized the independence of 4 of such small countries: Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia, and Montenegro, who joined a previously independent Greece. Never mind that concerns of the British diplomacy about small countries ending up fighting each other turned out to be fully justified, as illustrated by the First Balkan War, by the Second Balkan War, and by World War I, which started out, one could say, as the Third Balkan War. And within 40 years of the San Stefano Treaty, President Wilson formulated his ridiculous principle of national self-determination, and subsequently had to admit that he never expected to face all these nationalities, quote, which are coming to us day after day during the Versailles peace negotiations. As a consequence, no fewer than 13 small to medium-sized states came to occupy the space of the former Ottoman, Russian, and Austro-Hungarian empires. None of them, mind you, democratic, with perhaps one exception. And my narrative reaches the 20th century. The histories of World War I, World War II, and of the Cold War and its aftermath scarcely need recapitulating. 5 years ago, the British historian Jeremy Snyder published his magisterial Bloodlands. In it, he covers the history of the space between Germany on the one side and the Moscow-Stalingrad line on the other side from 1933 to 1945, and details how 14 million of its civilians, never mind the soldiers, 14 million of its civilians were annihilated. And elsewhere, what started with shots in Bosnia and Herzegovina ended with a war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which included the massacre of Srebrenica, the latest and one fervently hopes the last European instance of genocide. In terms of small nation nationalism, where 13 countries existed after Versailles, 22 countries took their place after the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the USSR, Yugoslavia, and Czechoslovakia. Poland, which in 1989 had 3 neighbors, had no fewer than 7 neighbors 5 years later, not one of them identical with the original 3. you can do the geography yourselves. So what is the role of this multitude of small to medium-sized countries? First, they all jealously protect their national identity. The Baltics are coping with Russian speakers. The Bulgarians have been intolerant of their Turks. The Hungarians practically assimilated their Slovak minority, whereas the considerably greater Hungarian minority in Slovakia is a constant irritant both in bilateral relations as in Slovak domestic policies. The Czechs have come close to perfection as their country emerged as almost ethnically pure. Their Jews perished in the Holocaust, their Germans were expelled in the aftermath of World War II, and they separated from Slovakia on the 1st of 1993. Now, if only they could handle the Roma question. And second, these countries feel insecure. Alone, none of them have any particular power. Not economic, not political, not military. Only Ukraine, Poland, and conceivably Romania can be considered mid-size in terms of population. For all of them, it has therefore been imperative to band with stronger European and Euro-Atlantic groupings, especially the EU and NATO. In the process, they willy-nilly ought to have supported each other as well. But the integration process is not over. Several West Balkan countries are still striving to join these organizations. The EU has pretty much shut its door to Ukraine and Moldova. Belarus is beyond the pale of even the European Council, which generally is the most inclusive of Europe's organizations. Greece, Slovakia, and Romania are among those who haven't recognized one of the 22, namely Kosovo. But the need to belong has become stronger these days with the Russian military escapades in Georgia and Ukraine, and today conceivably Belarus as well. Becoming part of something larger while maintaining their own national character has in general worked for these countries. One irksome question, however, is this: are they making their own contribution to the broader efforts, to the broader responsibilities of the groupings of which they have become members? Are they not just coasting? Are they paying their dues? And this, ladies and gentlemen, is where the refugee crisis serves as a prism for deconstructing various reactions. Before I go any further, though, I have to say that European institutions and politicians have failed us on this issue. They have failed the refugees quite miserably. Their reaction has been inconsistent, changing, unpredictable, and outright wrong. In curtailing Schengen, as some would, the EU is shooting itself in the foot. Skepticism about the EU is considerable under the best of circumstances. And for young people, actually, the main attraction of European integration is precisely the freedom and ease of foreign travel. Cheap flights, the Erasmus program, and Schengen. Refugees have met so far with hundreds of wonderful examples of solidarity and support. They have also met with inadvertent displays of thick-headedness, as when Czech police inscribed ID numbers on would-be immigrant arms. Only in ink, mind you, but the allusion was immediately obvious, however unintended it was. But they have also met with an outcry from far-right extremist parties, like Jobbik in Hungary and others elsewhere. Refugees have joined Jews, liberals, and the EU as whipping boys of these elements. And these attitudes are, of course, not limited to Central and Eastern Europe. Nevertheless, the memory of the 200,000 Hungarians who fled the country in 1956 and were welcomed in the democratic world doesn't seem to have left an indelible impression on Hungary's national psyche. Nor have the 200,000 refugees, including yours truly, who escaped Czechoslovakia in the wake of the 1968 Warsaw Pact invasion. One feels that the underlying motivation of the xenophobic attitude in Central and Eastern Europe — Slovakia has accepted fully 20 refugees — is fear. The fear of losing jobs is ridiculous. The latest Economist indicates that almost 20% of Czech companies have difficulties filling jobs. But when one of them publicly offered a certain number of jobs to refugees, it got mercilessly lambasted in the social media. The percentage of companies who have jobs, unfilled jobs, for Slovakia is almost 30%, for Poland over 40%, and for Hungary, unbelievably, over 55%. Equally ridiculous is the fear of terrorism. National intelligence agencies repeatedly signal that they have no indications of such a danger. After all, terrorists don't engage in weeks or even months-long desperate treks to create havoc. If nothing else, the Islamic State has been joined by some 5,000 people with perfectly valid Schengen passports, a much easier vehicle for effecting terror attacks. Perhaps the underlying fear is, and we get back to one of the key concerns of small countries, the underlying fear is national, ethnic, cultural, diluting the ethnic stock in essence, after having defended it for centuries against assorted empires and oppressors. Would my daughter marry him? But would the Hungarians become less Hungarian if they accepted a couple of thousand refugees? Hungary is a bad example. They have accepted many, many more right now. Would the Poles become less Polish? Before World War II, Czechoslovakia successfully integrated hundreds of thousands of Russians escaping Bolshevik power. Okay, there's an unmistakable cultural affinity there, you will argue. But a generation ago, the Czechs integrated many thousands of Vietnamese. And I wonder whether we have studied the lessons of these efforts. There is a sense, not only in Central and Eastern Europe, that multiculturalism, the principal policy for integrating non-native people, has failed. Some ethnics do integrate into the mainstream population, others not so easily. On the basis of the German experience with the Turks, of the French experience with North Africans, and indeed the Belgian experience with Moroccans, it appears that it is particularly difficult to integrate Muslims. One wonders how the US managed to integrate hundreds of thousands of Iranians. Still, even while facing mounting domestic disagreement, Angela Merkel would have Germany absorb 800,000 refugees, amounting to about 1% of Germany's population. In our small countries, it's a question of a couple of thousand people, nowhere near even 1/10 of 1% of our respective populations. I do hope that we take many of them in for a variety of reasons. I, for one, am looking forward to the first Syrian restaurant in Prague. Now, it is patently obvious that the current refugee crisis Europe is facing is nothing, absolutely nothing compared to the cataclysms I discussed at the outset. Black Death, the 30-Year War, the Napoleonic Wars, the genocides and bloodlands of the 20th century. However, there's a much broader question to be considered. To the extent that the current wave of refugees is only, quote-unquote, a result of the conflagrations in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria and Libya, and of the dictatorial regime in Eritrea, one simply has to hope that it can be and will be managed with whatever difficulties and in whatever time span. Resettling people in Europe should, of course, be just the last link in a chain of various efforts, and these should include energetic prosecution of people smugglers, robust protection of Europe's external borders, very, very generous support for refugee camps in Turkey, Jordan and Lebanon, which together house close to 4 million people, and finally, efforts to end the conflicts in the countries that source the refugee outflow. All of these points have to be addressed, and I suspect our leaders are addressing them today in Brussels, even as we speak. Well, don't hold your breath. But I fear this refugee crisis is only a wedge, only a preview of coming attractions, if you wish, of what is to become, what is to come. I fear that the continued flagrant income disparities between Europe on the one hand, including its poor parts, and many other regions of the world on the other hand, will result in ever greater population pressure on Europe's borders. And we can do all we can to distinguish between refugees and economic migrants. The pressure will stay. These disparities will magnify the push factor, even while Merkel's welcoming gesture may have increased the pull factor. The misery of some parts of the world will also, by the way, probably lead to fragmentation of countries and the formation of new entities. Robin Wright, who specializes in the Islamic world, predicted 2 years ago that Sunni areas of Syria and Iraq might unite, and the Islamic State has done just that. Iraqi Kurdistan is independent in everything but name. Syria and Libya have already splintered, probably irredeemably. But while Robin Wright predicted the split up of Libya into 3 historical provinces, the latest map of who controls what indicates no fewer than 7 or 8 forces in control of different areas. Forgive me the digression. I go even further. I look to a world 20 to 50 years hence, to the world of my teenage children. Today there are 60 million refugees and internally displaced persons worldwide, which is a scary number. But I look to a world affected by irreversible climatic changes that force mass movement of people in search of food, in search of water, indeed in search of dry land. Call it ecological migration. And let me point out that this will not be a complete novelty either. Timothy Snyder of Bloodlands has just published a new book called Black Earth, in which he apparently interprets Hitler's genocide of the Jews as retribution for the Jews allegedly causing a global ecological crisis. The fact that Hitler was mad didn't help his victims, and the concept of Lebensraum is one very aggressive expression of ecological migration. The changes I foresee might indeed spur cataclysms, the magnitude of which is hard to foresee. A would-be Czech politician, I don't want to mention his name, he doesn't need any further publicity, would create a concentration camp for immigrants, no less in Theresienstadt. He's a bit of a twit, but a recent public opinion poll in the Czech Republic indicated that if Adolf Hitler were resurrected today and promised to get rid of the refugee crisis, 51% of the population would vote for him. The number of victims of this future cataclysm will hopefully not compare with past horrors. But then again, when the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s broke out, who would have anticipated that they will result in 140,000 victims before the wars would end? But the chaos and disruption that will ensue will amount to a tempest caused in our multilateral global order, not by a religious schism, not by imperialist expansion, not by radical ideologies, but prosaically by global warming. They will amount to a perfect storm in which small democratic states will find it very challenging to maintain an even keel. These issues may be far from our minds today, but perhaps conferences like this one might concentrate our thinking in that direction. In that, I wish you lots of luck. Thank you for your attention.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to open now the second part of this panel, of this keynote, a discussion in which you are very welcome not only to raise your questions, but also to share any comments you might have to this very interesting speech we've just heard. So, please, let's start. No questions?
No question, no comment, no disagreement. Is this a Czech audience or what?
I just wonder whether I should speak English or Czech.
Take your pick.
Well, it doesn't matter. I will start.
Česky jsem se ještě naučil, takže...
Dobře, protože většina, myslím si, posluchačů je česky mluvících, tak česky. Já jsem teda tady z ministerstva, se představím, a mám na starosti migraci. Jsem zvláštní zmocněnec pro migraci. A vy jste tady vlastně, pane kolego, vylíčil velmi apokalyptickou vizi budoucnosti. A já si myslím, že ta přítomnost je možná, z mého soudu, možná ještě apokalyptičtější než ta budoucnost, že zase to tak strašné možná nebude. Ale chci říci, že Ta historická paralela samozřejmě tady nějaká je, vždycky nějakou najdeme. Můžeme zajít až vlastně do těch dob stěhování národů kvůli tehdy teda globálnímu ochlazení, nebo aspoň v Evropě. Ale co je podstatné, myslím, je to, abychom si uvědomili, že máme tady vlastně některé záležitosti, které se týkají migrace, které jsou přirozené, normální, bych řekla. A pak některé, které jsou vymknuté, bych řekla, to znamená ne zcela normální. To, co je přirozené a normální, je to, že vlastně my jsme po konci studené války znovu nastartovali globalizaci. Jo, ta obchodní výměna vlastně dosáhla celosvětová obchodní výměna dosáhla cifer před první světovou válkou až teprve koncem 80. let, na to se zapomíná. A spolu s tím také nastartuje zcela přirozený jev, a to je migrace za prací. Čili toto je něco, co jsme mohli předvídat. To, že skutečně svět dosáhl v minulých letech, od roku 2012-13, tolika světových krizí 3. stupně podle stupnice OSN, to jsme předvídat asi nemohli. A to je vlastně to, co se k tomuto fenoménu přidává. A my trošičku někdy, když o migraci mluvíme nebo slyšíme, tak mícháme prostě dvě věci dohromady. To, co je přirozené, a to, co i potřebujeme nakonec. To znamená určitá, dejme tomu, migrace za lepšími příležitostmi. To musíme zvládnout a musíme to zvládnout nějakými prostředky. A pak je tady ta opravdu uprchlická záležitost. A na to zase tu musíme zvládat jinými prostředky. A my máme trochu problém s tím, že prostě řešíme ty věci najednou a neřešíme vždycky dobře. Jo. A k tomu se přidává ten další fenomén, a to je organizovaný zločin, o kterém jsme dobře věděli, protože byl monitorován, ale nezasahlo se proti němu dostatečně brzy. A problém je v tom, že vy, když jste mluvil o tom receptu na to, jak tu krizi řešit, já s vámi plně souhlasím, tu nynější krizi, nebo my tomu říkáme krize z hlediska celosvětového, to pořád ještě žádná krize vlastně není. Ale tak tam chybí jeden element, a to je velmi promyšlená a kvalitní politika legální, zcela legální imigrace do Evropy. A to jak té za prací, tak i té azylové. Je zvláštní, že prostě azylanti, kteří požádají přímo tedy o víza na konzulátech, jsou třeba někdy odmítáni, zatímco ten, kdo prorazí kordon policistů na hranicích a dostane se sem tedy opravdu, jak si porušuje všechna pravidla, je prostě v lepší situaci, to by se také nemělo stávat. Ale já teda jsem optimista, já si myslím, že ta situace v Evropě politicky je nešťastná, to řešení není úplně šťastné momentálně, ale věřím, že snad to překonáme. Nicméně děkuji vám i za tu paralelu, i za to vaše řešení. Já se omlouvám, že jsem vzala chvilku času, ale když se nikdo nehlásil, tak možná teď už budou kolegové tady v sále a hosté mít více chuti diskutovat. Děkuji.
Dobrý den, Tomáš Weiss, Univerzita Karlova. Já vám moc děkuji za tu řeč. Podle mě byla velmi dobrá, velmi dobře pojmenovala řadu věcí, které v tom minimálně středoevropském veřejném prostoru do značné míry chybí. Já možná se zeptám, že tady padlo strašně moc věcí a já vlastně bych chtěl poděkovat paní velvyslankyni, zmocněnkyni pro migraci, protože zejména ta otázka legální imigrace nebo té regulérní imigrace, otevření těch regulérních kanálů pro migraci je asi klíčová a v tom balastu kolem té krize se do značné míry ztrácí, respektive nikdo si politicky nedokáže představit, jak to téma nadhodit, ačkoliv když se podíváme na Junckerových 10 bodů, tak tam to je poměrně jasně zdůrazněné. to zjednodušení regulérní migrace. Já bych se vrátil k tomu, řekněme, té teoretičtější části té vaší řeči, a to jsou ty malé státy. Vidíte budoucnost pro malé státy? Má to vůbec smysl udržovat tu úroveň vládnutí, řekněme, na té úrovni malého státu? Nebo máte dojem, že do budoucna ta úroveň vládnutí v té podobě toho malého státu, ekvivalentního v Evropě těm velkým státům, není udržitelná? Děkuji.
No tak já myslím, že probíhají dva opačné procesy. Na jedné straně bruselizace Evropy, kde postupně a čím dál zdá se mi pomaleji se předávají některé pravomoce do Bruselu. Kde to skončí, nevím, jestli to už neskončilo. A to by byla jediná z mého pohledu přijatelná podoba dalšího neudržování malých států, ale tak známky si samozřejmě můžou vydávat svoje, že ano. Ale zároveň je tu určitá decentralizace těch malých států, který máme. Já to vidím v Belgii, že ano. A všichni sledujeme Katalánsko a všichni jsme se dívali a budeme dívat na Skotsko. Takže jsou tady, myslím, souběžně dva rozdílné procesy až protichůdné. Jestli teoreticky by malé státy se měly udržet, nebo jestli bychom je měli všechny sloučit dohromady, jako sloučit těch 6-7 středoamerických republik a udělat zase velkou Guatemalu. No jo, to nikdo neudělá samozřejmě, nikdy.
Thank you for your talk, for your opening statement. There is one...
I'm sorry, have we met? Maybe you could introduce yourself.
I'm sorry, yeah.
Yes.
My name is Soli Özel. I'm a Richard von Weizsäcker Fellow at the Bosch Academy in Berlin and from Turkey at Kadir Has University. There's one thing that I think you kind of indirectly alluded to, but did not really put as starkly as you did all other things, and that is, you talked about ecological problems, which are true, and in addition to that, in Africa, the population is going to double in the next 25 years. Unless you find jobs for those people, sustenance for those people, a kind of way of getting their life going for those people, they're going to come. And the number of people living in this continent is going to shrink, and everybody else is going to increase. And I must say I was flabbergasted by how surprised the Europeans were when the Syria problem that they thought was happening in a different planet suddenly decided to present itself in the capitals. How do you suggest the EU, that could not see really the point of its nose in the past 4.5 years, will be able to manage a more ambitious program as the one you have suggested, number one. Number two, there is this pressure, there is the so-called urgency of the present in democratic countries in terms of elections, electorates, their bigotry, their prejudices, their maybe unfounded fears, as opposed to what needs to be done if you put everything rationally, and of course those things do not always happen rationally. How do you reconcile these two imperatives? Those would be my questions.
Next question. I don't know how to handle the second question at all. I mean, that I would just leave. But as to your first question, we have, what I have been witnessing in Brussels in the years that I've lived there working for the European Commission and then in retirement, but still keeping my finger on the pulse. What I think I see is a discrepancy between what the European Commission can put together as a nationality or ethnicity-free body, what it can put together in terms of proposals and so forth, and where the nation states, the member states, when they come in, they can just sweep it aside and ignore anything that the Commission will have prepared. I'm not going to say that the Commission is terribly good in everything that it does, but it's not half bad, frankly. And I think the Commission is much better than its reputation to start with. But I think there is really a discrepancy between the people who in the Commission are interested in Europe and the people who meet, as today the leaders are meeting in Brussels, who are interested in the next national elections. And I'm not sure that these two diverging, or frequently diverging perspectives are compatible. And the result yesterday of the Interior Ministers' negotiations in Brussels, which ended up with the hammer coming down and forcing actually a European decision on 4 or 5 countries, I forget, is a novel aspect. It's the first time anybody remembers that the consensus principle among leaders has been violated. It is the first time that the long-fought mechanisms for counting which country has how many votes came into effect. It's the first time, probably not the last, and what it will probably lead to is a further, getting back to gentleman's question, is further disillusionment with the European Union and further cracks in the European edifice.